Ethan Caldwell learned very early how to disappear without leaving a room. He was born in a quiet town in Oregon where houses looked identical and conversations stayed shallow. His parents weren't cruel, but they were exhausted. His father worked long shifts and came home hollowed out by routine. His mother carried a constant tension that made emotions feel like inconveniences rather than expressions. When Ethan cried as a child, he was told to calm down. When he talked too much, he was told to give adults space. When he needed reassurance, he learned quickly that silence was safer than asking. So he adapted. He became the easy child, the one who didn't need much. Teachers praised him for being mature. Relatives admired how independent he was. No one noticed that independence wasn't a strength he chose, it was a skill he developed to survive. In school, Ethan hovered at the edges of social groups. He wasn't bullied, but he wasn't invited either. He learned how to observe people instead of joining them. He noticed how friendships formed over shared jokes and mutual vulnerability, two things he never quite learned how to offer. He tried once in middle school opening up to a boy he thought might understand him. That boy laughed, not out of cruelty, but discomfort. That was enough. Ethan closed the door again. From that moment on, he decided it was better to be unreadable than exposed. As the years passed, his inner world grew richer while his outer one grew quieter. He read obsessively. Psychology books, philosophy, novels where characters felt things deeply and spoke honestly. He felt more alive in imagined conversations than real ones. In high school, he sat at lunch with different groups on different days, never staying long enough to belong. People described him as calm, reserved, mysterious. None of them knew how much effort it took to maintain that calm, or how loud his thoughts became at night when no one else was around. By the time Ethan reached adulthood, solitude had hardened into structure. He lived alone, worked remotely, kept his routines tight and predictable. He exercised at the same time every day, ate the same meals, slept at the same hours. His life ran smoothly because it depended on no one. On the outside, it looked disciplined. On the inside, it was controlled. Relationships felt chaotic to him, unpredictable, emotionally expensive. He told himself he preferred being alone. And on many days, he believed it. But then there were the other nights, the ones where he scrolled endlessly, not for entertainment, but for evidence that other people existed. Nights where he replayed old conversations, wondering if a different tone or sentence might have changed something. Nights where he imagined what it would feel like to have someone ask how he was and actually wait for the answer. He never reached out. He didn't want to be a burden. He didn't want to misread interest. He didn't want to confirm the fear that maybe no one would choose him if given the option. Once, in his late 20s, he almost broke the pattern. A coworker named Daniel invited him for coffee. It wasn't dramatic, just a casual offer. Ethan said yes, then spent the entire day rehearsing what to say, how to act, how much of himself to reveal. During the conversation, he laughed at the right moments, nodded at the right times, kept things light. Daniel seemed comfortable, too comfortable. When the coffee ended and the invitation didn't extend beyond that one meeting, Ethan felt something close to grief. Not because he lost a friend, but because he had briefly allowed himself to imagine one. He went back to his routines after that, tighter this time, safer. Years passed quietly. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Holidays blurred together. Ethan told himself he was fine, and in many ways he was. But sometimes, standing in his kitchen late at night, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, he felt an ache he couldn't name. Not loneliness exactly. Something more specific, like a life lived just slightly out of sync with everyone else, like standing behind glass, watching connection happen for others, wondering what it would take to step through without breaking. And the question he never allowed himself to answer was simple and terrifying. Was he truly meant to be alone, or had he just learned to live that way too well? Have you ever noticed how some people move through the world quietly? Not necessarily sad, not broken, just distant, as if they're living one step to the side of everyone else. You can sense it in the way they listen more than they speak, in how they observe rooms before entering them emotionally. People with no friends often give off this presence, not because they dislike others, but because something in their life taught them to exist without leaning on anyone. This doesn't begin in adulthood. It begins slowly, invisibly, long before anyone calls it loneliness. For many, the roots stretch back to childhood, where the first lessons about connection are learned. Some children grow up in homes where emotions are inconvenient, where expressing need is met with criticism, distraction, or silence. Over time, the child adapts. They learn that being low maintenance keeps the peace, that self-containment is safer than vulnerability. Silence becomes a strategy, not a preference. And when silence is practiced long enough, it stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like identity. Others weren't ignored outright, they were forgotten in subtler ways. The middle child who learned to stay small. The quiet one praised for independence when what they really needed was guidance. They didn't learn how to ask for help because no one noticed when they needed it. Independence in these cases isn't empowerment, it's emotional self-sufficiency born from lack. Then there are those raised in unpredictable environments, homes where closeness came with conditions, where love depended on moods, stress levels, or performance. These children learn that intimacy is unstable, that opening up is risky. So they keep emotional distance not because they don't crave connection, but because their nervous system associates it with danger. That association doesn't disappear with age. It becomes wired. People with no friends don't enter adulthood thinking they don't need anyone. More often, they enter believing that dependence leads to disappointment, that needing others creates vulnerability, and vulnerability in their experience has a cost. This isn't confidence, it's conditioning. And conditioning runs deeper than logic. Over time, repeated losses reinforce the pattern. Friendships that faded without explanation. People who drifted, betrayed trust, or stopped choosing them. Eventually, the mind looks for meaning. It tries to protect the heart by creating a narrative. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm too much. Maybe I'm not enough. Withdrawal begins as a defense mechanism long before it becomes a lifestyle. This is why people with no friends are often hyper-aware. They notice tone shifts, pauses, subtle changes in energy, not because they're paranoid, but because their nervous system has learned to anticipate rejection. Research in neuroscience shows that social pain activates the same brain regions as physical injury. The brain doesn't distinguish much between a broken bone and a broken bond. After enough emotional injuries, it adapts by pulling inward. It becomes cautious, protective, observant. This heightened awareness can be exhausting. Every interaction feels like walking on unstable ground. You're constantly scanning for signs of withdrawal. A delayed reply can spiral into hours of self-doubt. A change in behavior can feel like confirmation of an unspoken fear. It's not drama, it's survival logic learned too early. And yet, there's another layer most people miss. People who spend long stretches alone often develop incredibly rich inner worlds. They think deeply. They feel deeply. They analyze patterns, behaviors, meanings. Their minds are rarely idle. Because observation becomes their primary way of engaging with the world, they grow emotionally intelligent in quiet ways. They learn to read rooms without speaking, to understand motives without being told, to sense authenticity from distance. Ironically, this depth makes shallow connection unbearable. Small talk feels hollow. Surface-level relationships feel draining. Group dynamics feel loud and disorganized. The internal world doesn't match the external environment. And when that mismatch repeats often enough, the person doesn't conclude that something is wrong with them. They conclude that connection itself is incompatible. So they stop trying. Not dramatically, not consciously. They just invest more into solitude, because solitude is predictable, familiar. It doesn't reject you, it doesn't misunderstand you, and at first it feels peaceful, controlled, safe. But solitude has a shadow side. There are nights when it becomes heavy, when the silence presses inward instead of outward, when the mind loops through old memories, imagined futures, hypothetical conversations that never happen. People with no friends often carry unspoken anxiety, the kind that comes from constantly evaluating yourself, wondering if you missed something, if you misread a moment, if you're fundamentally different in a way that makes connection impossible. They are often harsher on themselves than anyone else ever has been. Self-criticism becomes a background noise, a quiet narrator reminding them why staying alone might be easier than risking awkwardness or rejection. And slowly, the belief forms that connection is something other people are better suited for. What's rarely acknowledged is that many friendless people are highly empathetic. Loneliness forces introspection. It sharpens emotional awareness. Studies in psychology suggest that people who spend more time alone often show heightened sensitivity to emotional cues and moral reasoning. They don't lack social ability, they lack safety. Society doesn't make this easier. We celebrate extroversion, busy social calendars, group photos, loud laughter, constant connection. Anyone who doesn't fit that image is labeled antisocial or unmotivated. But not everyone thrives in crowds. Some people need slow, deliberate connection. They need emotional spaciousness. They need silence that isn't awkward, and those environments are rare. Still, there's a cost to prolonged isolation. Humans are wired for connection. Chronic loneliness has been linked to increased stress hormones, disrupted sleep, and even cognitive decline. The absence of being seen wears on the nervous system over time. Some people wake up one day and realize they haven't shared a real moment with another person in years. That realization doesn't scream. It aches. Yet even then, people like Ethan don't rush toward others. They move carefully, they observe, they test emotional safety in small ways, because when you've lived without connection, you don't gamble it easily. And when they finally do find someone who understands silence, who doesn't demand performance, who listens without rushing to fill gaps, they become extraordinary friends, loyal, present, attentive. They don't take connection for granted because they know what absence feels like. If you see yourself in this, understand this. Loneliness is not proof of failure. It's often evidence of sensitivity, depth, and high emotional standards. You're not behind. You're not broken. You've simply been shaped by experiences that taught you to survive alone. And perhaps the quietest truth is this. Solitude isn't the end of your story. It's the space where you learned who you are. And one day when the right connection arrives, you won't have to become louder or different to deserve it. You'll just have to be seen. What makes this kind of loneliness especially difficult is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like isolation in the dramatic sense. There's no obvious crisis, no single moment where everything falls apart. Instead, it settles in quietly, disguising itself as preference, as independence, as strength. People with no friends often hear things like, "You're so self-sufficient," or "You don't need anyone," and those comments land strangely. They sound like compliments, but they reinforce the very pattern that keeps connection distant. Over time, the person begins to confuse coping with identity. They stop asking whether they are alone because they want to be, or because they learned how to survive that way. There's also the issue of timing. Many people who grow up emotionally guarded don't develop social confidence at the same pace as their peers. While others are learning how to repair conflict, set boundaries, and recover from awkwardness, the guarded person is learning how to avoid exposure altogether. They miss the messy practice of connection. So later, when opportunities appear, they feel out of sync. Everyone else seems fluent in a language they never fully learned. That gap can feel humiliating even though it isn't their fault. Psychologists often talk about attachment styles, but what's rarely emphasized is how adaptive these patterns once were. Emotional distance wasn't a flaw when it formed, it was a solution. It kept you safe in environments where openness wasn't rewarded. The problem is that solutions don't always age well. What protected you early in life can limit you later, especially when circumstances change but the nervous system doesn't get the memo. Another hidden factor is how people with no friends experience time. Without shared memories being constantly reinforced through conversation, experiences can feel strangely unreal, as if they didn't fully happen. Social connection helps anchor moments. It validates reality. When that's missing, life can feel like it's passing slightly out of focus. Days blend together, milestones go unmarked. Not because they don't matter, but because there's no one to witness them. This is where many people start to question their own significance. Not in a dramatic existential way, but subtly. If no one sees me, does what I experience matter? This question isn't narcissistic, it's human. We are social beings. Being witnessed is part of how meaning forms. Without it, even achievements can feel hollow. At the same time, people who live this way often develop an intense internal compass. Because external validation is scarce, they rely on internal standards. They become thoughtful about their values, careful with their choices. They don't chase approval easily. This can look like emotional strength from the outside, and in some ways it is. But it also means they carry everything alone. Every doubt, every fear, every decision. There's a moment many friendless people recognize but rarely talk about. It's when something good happens and there's no one to tell. Not because no one exists, but because there's no one who feels close enough. That moment reveals how much connection actually matters. It exposes the lie that independence is enough. Self-sufficiency can keep you stable, but it can't replace being known. Interestingly, Research shows that people who have experienced long-term loneliness often become extremely selective about relationships. They don't want many connections. They want one or two that feel safe and genuine. This selectivity isn't arrogance, it's wisdom shaped by pain. When connection has been costly, you learn to invest carefully. If you've ever wondered why you don't seem to click with most people, this may be why. Your nervous system isn't looking for excitement or novelty, it's looking for regulation, for consistency, for emotional safety. That narrows the field dramatically. But it also means that when connection does happen, it's profound. This is why forcing yourself into social situations rarely works long term. You can't override a nervous system with logic alone. You can't convince yourself to feel safe by telling yourself you should. Safety is learned through experience, through repeated moments of being met without judgment, and those moments take time. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in these patterns, pause for a moment, take a breath, and if this perspective resonates with you, if it puts words to something you've felt but never fully understood, take a second to like the video, not as an obligation, but as a small signal that you're not alone in this experience, even if it feels that way sometimes. One of the most damaging myths about loneliness is that it means you're socially incompetent. In reality, many lonely people are socially skilled. They know how to listen. They know how to read emotion. They know how to adapt. What they struggle with isn't interaction. It's trust. Trust that connection won't cost more than it gives. Trust that opening up won't lead to withdrawal. Trust that they won't be too much or not enough. There's also grief involved. Grief for friendships that never formed, for versions of life that might have been different under other circumstances. This grief doesn't always have an object, which makes it harder to process. You can't mourn what never clearly existed. So it stays unresolved, sitting quietly beneath the surface. Over time, this unresolved grief can harden into resignation. People stop hoping for connection not because they don't want it, but because wanting hurts. Hope becomes risky, and so they lower expectations. They tell themselves they're fine. They focus on productivity, routine, self-improvement, all admirable things, but none of them replace connection. What's important to understand is that nothing is wrong with needing others. Needing connection doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. The problem isn't that you need people. The problem is that you learned early on that needing people wasn't safe. Change when it comes is rarely dramatic for people like this. It doesn't arrive as a sudden burst of confidence. It comes quietly, through one person who listens without rushing, one conversation that doesn't feel performative, one moment where silence feels shared instead of empty. Often the first step isn't finding friends. It's unlearning the belief that you're a burden. That belief distorts everything. It turns neutral interactions into perceived rejection. It convinces you that your presence needs justification. Letting go of that belief takes time and gentleness. You don't need to become more outgoing. You don't need to change your personality. You don't need to force yourself into spaces that feel overwhelming. What you need is permission to move at your own pace, to seek connection that aligns with your nervous system, not against it. People like Ethan don't suddenly transform into social butterflies. They slowly allow themselves to be seen piece by piece. They test safety in small ways. They learn that not every connection requires full exposure, that boundaries can coexist with closeness. And when connection finally takes root, it doesn't feel loud or dramatic. It feels calm, familiar, like exhaling after holding your breath for years. That's how you know it's right. If you've spent much of your life alone, remember this. The skills you developed weren't mistakes, they were adaptations. They kept you alive emotionally. But adaptation doesn't mean permanence. You're allowed to evolve. You're allowed to want more. The world doesn't always make space for quiet people, but that doesn't mean there's no place for you. It just means your kind of connection is rarer, slower, and deeper, and those things take time to find. Until then, solitude doesn't mean you're unlovable. It means you're still learning where you belong. And when you finally meet someone who sees your quiet not as absence, but as presence, you'll realize something important. You were never too much or too little. You were simply waiting for a connection that could meet you where you are.